Welcome into the Grace Point Daily podcast. My name is Jeremiah Johnson. This is going to be a verse-by-verse edition of going through the Bible with none other than Rick Maynard on the Grace Point Daily podcast. We exist to bring you daily encouragement for your daily walk with Christ. So thank you for joining us, guys. I know the Grace Point Daily podcast has been reduced to just like the verse-by-verse only the past month now, just because we've been doing so much other live stuff. And we do want to let you know that on now the Grace Point Daily podcast, you can watch on Facebook Live if that's your pleasure, or you want to see Dr. R.B. Maynard's beautiful face instead of listening to just your voice. You can get both visual and audio experience now.
That may drive them away even further.
So thanks for joining us. And so if you're on Facebook Live, you can share it that way. If you're on the podcast, you can like, share, and subscribe to that as well. So thank you very much for dialing in. All right, Rick Maynard, let's get into the word today.
Okay, here we go. 1 Kings 12:16, and this we're in the middle of that story where Rehoboam is trying to figure out what to do, and he should have asked the elders, but he winds up asking his friends what to do. He gets bad advice, and so he's having some problems here in his reigning as king. So in verse 16 it says, "When all Israel saw that the king refused to listen to them, they answered the king, 'What share do we have in David? What part in Jesse's son? To your tents, O Israel, look after your own house, O David.' So the Israelites went home." So they're having this debate about who's in charge and whose advice you want to listen to. And the people are mad at the government, basically. You know, it's amazing because when you read these stories about government in the Old Testament, it really sounds familiar for us today. People aren't happy and they want to take things into their own hands or whatever. But it's just, what's amazing here is we've been through David and all that David did. We've been through Solomon and everything that he did. But within a few days, all of that just starts getting wiped out. It's like all these great things. It's like you don't remember where you came from and how you had God's blessing. But people have always, my favorite saying is people are always been people. They've always been this way. We think this is something new that goes on today, but it's just how quickly we forget. And they're basically like, who's right here? Is David's descendants? I mean, they're supposed to rule forever, so that would be Solomon and Rehoboam. And then their idea is, well, shouldn't people have a right to vote? And that's what we look at things. And I've been mistaken in my past, even in the church. I used to think that board members should stand up and say, well, I'm kind of like political. Well, I believe this, and I think we should do this, and to get voted on. I mean, I actually had that mentality rather than trusting board members and pastors to take care of things. And so that's what people were doing here. It's like, well, we want to vote. We don't want you just to be king. We want to tell you what to do in this situation. But and shouldn't Rehoboam listen to them? That idea of, well, you think just because you're the king's son that, we ought to listen to you. And so it's just that idea of you can take care of your own house, but leave us alone. We'll take care of ourselves. We don't need you to tell us what to do. And again, it goes to the government today. It goes to the church today. Don't I have as much to say as the pastor? I mean,
no, I'm just kidding.
well,
I know everything.
And I've been here all these years. I should know more about how to run this church than you do. I mean, we get that. We start getting that mentality sometime. But verse 17, "But as for the Israelites who were living in the towns of Judah, Rehoboam still ruled over them." So it was a divided nation, which, again, was never in God's plan. We always say God knew what was coming, but it's not necessarily his plan. He wouldn't have wanted a divided nation, 12 tribes, and you got 10 and 2, so you've got really what you have is Republican and Democrat. And I've never really understood that. I'm not a very wise political person, but I've never understood how you have these two parties and you're just if you're a Republican, you're terrible if you vote with the Democrats. I mean, they're just going to throw you out. So it's almost like one vote against another. So whoever's got the most got the most Republicans or Democrats, that's who's gonna win. But so one of the commentaries says Even the tribes of Judah and Benjamin didn't want Rehoboam, but they had no choice since they lived in the cities of Judah and they were surrounded by his troops and supporters. So they got a king that they didn't want, but they had to accept it because, again, majority rules in that situation. And I always said, majority rules, but majority is not always right. I mean, that's the way it is in politics in general. But 1218, King Rehoboam sent out Adoniram, who was in charge of forced labor, but all Israel stoned him to death. King Rehoboam, however, managed to get into his chariot and escape to Jerusalem. And this is the same Adoniram was a guy who had worked for Solomon. He collected taxes, was in charge of workforce. So, I mean, he was probably a good man. But Israel was like, we don't want this guy, and they stoned him to death. I mean, we just can't imagine.
It's one way of doing it, getting rid of a leader, right?
I mean, yeah. If you see anybody come in carrying any rocks,
right.
Don't worry about guns and knives, but rocks would be, the biblical way of taking care of it. So, but and he had reasoned with the people. He'd been a good man, and he comes along. They stone him, and Rehoboam runs for his life. And Rehoboam had been pretty arrogant in all of this. Like, I deserve to be king. I inherited this throne. I mean, he had been pretty arrogant, and now he's running for his life. And I think that's just part of what God. That's the way He deals with people sometimes. It's like, if you're gonna be all haughty and arrogant, then we'll see. God has a way to humble us.
Yes.
To bring us back to earth. So.
Those who exalt themselves will be humbled. Those who humble themselves will be exalted.
I always tell this when I talk about being haughty, which is kind of a biblical word of arrogance. But when I was probably 16 years old, and we were having a VBS at the old church, and they had the memory verse was, now I can't even remember it.
Old man.
Oh, man, the haughty spirit.
Haughty eyes?
Haughty spirit goes before a fall.
Okay.
And one of the kids said, pride goeth before destruction, but a haughty spirit before a fall.
Okay.
And the kid raised his hand to say it, and he said, pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty body before a fall.
Yeah.
So it kind of changed that word there a little bit. So 12:19, so Israel has been in rebellion against the house of David to this day. And we can't read that, obviously, to this day, but to the day that this was written. And it was a rebellion. But, even, and we talked about this last week, even a rebellion, even things that don't appear to be the will of God are the will of God. Not, and, you can get into the will of God, the permissive will of God, the perfect will of God, all those things. But God has a plan through all of that. And sometimes He just allows things that don't look like they should be His will. I mean, we say that about presidents. Oh, I like this president. He's a Christian man, and that must be God's will. And then we get a guy in there that's not a Christian, and, the people voted him in, and that's not God's will. It may have been God's will to bring people to where they need to be. So that's what's going on here. It's done according to the will of God. They didn't have an order from God, but everything was done without consulting God. They were just on their own. This was not Congress going into a private session to have prayer and fasting to figure out what to do. This is just people's making choices and majority rules. And wouldn't it be awesome in government today to somebody say, hey, we're taking 2 days and we're going to lock ourselves in and pray about this situation. I mean, I doubt that we're ever going to see that, but maybe, a miracle can happen. But, and I've used this example before as things that can be God's will, but in the wrong time, in the wrong way that it's done. And I've used the illustration of David and Bathsheba that, someone said one time, one of the commentaries, it was always the will of God for David to have Bathsheba. Well, if you'd leave that statement there, it'd be like, well, that's not, that was a whole bad situation. But the idea was that maybe God had Bathsheba for David, but David got ahead of himself. Maybe Uriah was going to be killed in battle. and God was going to give David Bathsheba. But instead,
Yeah.
he got ahead, pushed the agenda, had him murdered, the whole situation. So sometimes it's a matter of God's will, but we push too hard to make it happen, and then it puts us out of the will of God. Anyway, we'll move on from there. But
this is might sound completely way off, but I just started reading the Chronicles of Narnia to my boys again, and there's a book in there where they're supposed to Aslan, who's Jesus, they're supposed to follow him this direction, but they go the other direction. They almost get killed by the enemy forces. Then they go back the other direction. Then they go the right direction. Anyway, they finally get on track, but then they talk with Aslan, and they're like, they pose the question, what would have happened if we would have followed you the first time?
Right.
And I love that question because it's very theological. It is a very deep thought that it's putting in a kid's book, but like, what would have happened if we would have followed you the first time?
Right.
And basically he was like, well, you'll never know that. So it's kind of like, I don't think we'll ever know, there's probably points in our, you look back and there's probably all kinds of parts in our spiritual journey. We probably should have went another way, but we didn't. God still worked through it, around it, brought us to the place we do need to be. But what would have happened if I would have done this or wouldn't have done that when I made a bad choice? I don't think we have to worry about that, but
yeah, well, that always reminds me of the movies where you see someone who goes back in time. But
Back to the Future.
Right. They really can't change anything because if they change it, it changes everything, So
Avengers Endgame.
Mm-hmm. So those kind of things, they really do happen. People really do go back in time.
Yeah.
I've seen those time machines.
Thanos finger snap.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just got to find the wormhole.
Right. 12:20. When all the Israelites heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent and called him to the assembly and made him king over all Israel. Only the tribe of Judah remained loyal to the house of David. So Jeroboam has just kind of waited for Rehoboam to hang himself. I mean, he's a clever politician. It's like, well, if I just leave him alone, he'll ruin himself, and I won't even have to do anything. I'll be able to take over. And again, that would be a clever politician. When you see somebody that's just being stupid in politics, well, hey, maybe if I just wait, I don't even have to say anything because he's going to ruin himself, and then I can step into the picture. So that's exactly what happened. 12:21, when Rehoboam arrived in Jerusalem, he mustered the whole house of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, 180,000 fighting men, to make war against the house of Israel and to regain the kingdom for Rehoboam, son of Solomon. They probably could have accomplished this. Again, you have the will of God in different areas where God just says, I just think he's up there sometimes giving that nod yes or nod no. You can try this, but I'm not going to allow it, or I'm going to allow it because it's going to accomplish something else. And that's a hard thing for us, because we think, well, how could this be the will of God? I mean, you and I both have been in this life long enough that we've seen so many things in our lives that it's like, how is that possibly the will of God?
Yeah.
For someone to be sick, we see especially with dementia and Alzheimer's and having to watch people waste away. And
my dad has Parkinson's right now, really bad.
I mean, it's, there is no answer. I mean, it really does come down, if people want to ask those questions, well, how does a loving God? I don't know. I mean, that's where it takes our faith that we can, even though we still might have some questions, we can look past those things and say, I don't know, but somehow God is in this.
Yep.
And it feels like sometimes that God has just thrown up his arms and left us to ourselves, to figure it out. So Rehoboam, anyway, he's tried to, or he's hung himself basically, and Jeroboam now has stepped in, and we forget about these 180,000 fighting men. I mean, can you imagine what these battles look like? I mean, I've watched. One of my favorite movies is Braveheart.
Okay.
And they did a lot of that where they had the 100,000 soldiers, and I don't know if they did that by computer, generated things or how they did it, but it really puts a perspective on the number of guys that are dead laying out in those fields. And I mean, these wars had to be amazing. As far as we just read through the numbers sometimes and don't really think about it, but God's will is going to be done regardless of the obstacles. When He says this is the way it's going to be, this is going to be the end result, then those obstacles that come along, He's opening doors, He's shutting doors. I heard somebody say one time when God shuts a door, sometimes we may need to kick it open. And I thought, no, I don't think. You might say that if a door shuts, you might need to kick it open. Not if God shuts the door, you don't kick the door open. But 22 through 24, these all kind of tie together. But this word of God came to Shemaiah, the man of God, say to Rehoboam, son of Solomon, king of Judah, to the whole house of Judah and Benjamin, and to the rest of the people, this is what the Lord says. So this is a prophet speaking. Do not go up and fight against your brothers, the Israelites. Go home, every one of you, for this is my doing. So they obeyed the word of the Lord and went home again as the Lord had ordered. So this is the prophet speaking, and I've said it almost every time we talk about the prophetic. You talk about the fact it has to line up with the will of God, and the prophet a lot of times is not the popular guy. He's just saying, I'm just telling you what God said. Mm-hmm. And what's so amazing is how, sometimes the prophets weren't very well respected.
No.
But you've got a case here where these guys are ready to go fight, and the prophet comes along and says, don't do this, and they all turn around and go home. This guy must have been a well-respected, we better do what he says, or we're going to be paying for this thing. And so this prophet, it says, there's a place where it talks about the acts of Shemaiah the prophet, and it's in the lost books of the Old Testament. And even if you go, in 2 Chronicles 12:15, it says, now the acts of Rehoboam, first and last, are they not written in the book of Shemaiah the prophet and of Iddo the seer concerning the genealogies? And there were wars between Rehoboam and Jeroboam continually. So again, if we were really in depth on a lot of these things, we'd bring in Chronicles into this, because Chronicles tells a lot of the same stories that Kings. Sometimes it adds more, sometimes Kings has more, if you begin to bring all those things together. And so it's actually talking about a book of Shemaiah the prophet, that there was actually books written by him and about him that we don't have access to. Most of these old books, they know they existed because the Bible tells us they existed, but we don't always still have them. I think Josephus is probably the closest thing we have to actually having the availability to go to the bookstore and buy a book. You can't go buy the Acts of Shemaiah.
Right, yeah.
So, but finally, Rehoboam has accepted and begins to act in the right way. Things get set in motion. You can't change it now. And I couldn't help but think about things in our life that, just like you were saying, we want to change that. I wish I could go back. I wish I could have done something differently. And I think about that because it's a big issue now in pregnancy with abortion. Mm-hmm. Pregnancy used to be, before we had not even legalized abortion, but illegal abortion. It used to be when someone was pregnant, it was like, you set this in motion, so you got a baby to raise now. Mm-hmm. That's just the way it was. There was no other alternative. And now that has become, there's plenty of, there is an alternative. Yeah. You don't have to raise that baby. You don't have to even have the baby. Mm-hmm. Back in, when I was a kid or whatever, back then, it was like, well, you have the baby, and then if you don't want it, you could put it up for adoption. Yep. Or the old thing about leaving them on the steps of the fire departments. And I think, honestly, you can still do that. I think that's a legal way of, I hate to say disposing of a baby, but there's some kind of a law that if you have a baby that you can't take care of her, or whatever, I think you can legally. I better not say that too strong here. I might be, all you mothers out there, don't drop your babies off at the fire department. But someone would need to research that if that was something they had in mind. But then the other thing today, how many grandparents are raising children? Mm-hmm. They're raising their grandkids,
Yes.
And it's just, it got all twisted up, and we're not here to talk about abortion, but we're talking about things that can be changed, things that can't be changed, and how those things have changed over the years where we've made, you almost have too many choices. Mm-hmm. I say that when I go to the store. It's like, why does there have to be 15 different kinds of bread?
Right.
Or, I go to the lumber yard and there's 5 different kinds of breakers to go in a breaker box or something like that. And it's like, why can't there just be one that works? And
that's why In-N-Out Burger got so popular in the West Coast. You've been in In-N-Out Burger before?
Yeah.
You can get a hamburger, a cheeseburger, or a double cheeseburger.
Yeah.
That's all you get.
Yep.
French fries and a drink.
Yep.
It's awesome.
Too many choices. But
they do have a secret menu, but anyway.
Well, yeah, it's not a McDonald's burger. So, and then the other thing about when you're dealing with these guys that are kings and they're looking for advice and they're asking the people and then they're asking their friends and all of those. When they make a decision, they need to appear strong. And I don't know, I never did watch presidential things too much till just the last few years. We didn't have the access, Again, when I was a kid, you had 3 stations. The news came on at 10 o'clock at night,
ABC, NBC, and
CBS.
CBS, oh, there you go.
You got 3 choices. You could watch the news at night for 30 minutes, and that's all the news you got. And that was news, weather, sports in 30 minutes. So you got the headlines, and that was it. Today we have so much access that we don't even know what to believe. But in all my times of watching presidents, I don't think that I've ever seen a president cry. I don't think I've ever seen one get choked up while he was talking about an issue or whatever. And I'm sure that probably, Donald Trump was not a politician, so he didn't know the rules, the etiquette, I guess, of being a politician. I bet you somebody told him, don't ever cry don't ever appear weak. I think that's probably what they would tell him. Mm-hmm. And
yes,
I don't agree with that. I think we've talked about Brother Perkins. Shout out to Brother Perkins today, but
James Perkins.
Yes, his father-in-law was one of the most tender-hearted men that I've ever seen. Mm-hmm. We would go to men's retreat, and he always did on the last service they had communion before he went home. And I've never seen him, and I've heard him preach a few times outside of that. I've never seen him preach a sermon or do the communion, which is you can get caught up in the repetition, the formality of communion, and it loses its meaning to you. But I've never seen him preach or do that communion service without breaking down at some point. And I never looked at, wow, man, what a weak man. I was just always impressed that it meant so much. And not everybody's a crier. Mm-hmm. And I've broken down before, not just while I was preaching or teaching, not just weeping and uncontrollable, but there's times I get choked up sometimes.
Yeah.
And
there's no crying in baseball.
Yeah. There's no crying.
My boys
in church.
saw that movie trailer the other day, and they thought that was hilarious. There's no crying in baseball. There's no crying in church.
Yeah, we don't want to advertise any movies here, so you can look that one up too. But
Greg Walden says hello. What's up, Greg Walden?
Yeah, Greg Walden.
He's watching right now.
Why aren't you working, Greg? You should be working.
He is working. He is working. He's got a government job. Okay.
Oh yeah, I forgot. That's not real work, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, we better leave Greg alone, or he'll tune back out again.
The government's listening right now as we speak, actually.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll go a couple more here. 12:25. Then Jeroboam fortified Shechem in the hill country of Ephraim and lived there. From there he went out and built Peniel, So this is just talking about where he went, what he did in these different situations. And we want, again, if you went to Chronicles, there's a whole other section. I think I got it written, 2 Chronicles 11, 5 through 12. If you read that, it has to do with this story here about a little more detail about why he went there and why he built different things, but we won't go on to that. 26 and 27, Jeroboam thought to himself, the kingdom will now likely revert to the house of David. If these people go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, they will again give their allegiance to the Lord. Rehoboam, king of Judah, they will kill me and return to Rehoboam. So, I mean, there's just, again, these two guys are just back and forth with each other. And, I'm sure there's jealousy, and one of them wants to take over, and the other one's they're fighting against each other to have control of the whole situation, which it still doesn't work for them. And we've talked about it before, that this doesn't end here. It just goes on and on. There's another king, and again, we've talked about it on Wednesday nights. This king did worse than the last king, and then the next king, it says he did worse than any other king before him. So, and even with a word from the Lord, I mean, these guys were hearing not just the friends, but they were hearing from the prophet. But even with a word from the Lord, they still wanted to do their own thing. Even when God said, okay, thus saith the Lord, this is the way it is, these guys were still turning and fighting against each other and trying to do their own things. And it just does not work when God says something for all of us, whether you're the king or just us in our daily lives. When God says something and we refuse and decide to go our own, it's just not going to go well. It's never going to be, and we might feel like it does. Well, God told me to do this, and I did this, and I made more money. God told me to be a pastor, but I decided to become a engineer, and I'm making way more money as an engineer. It's still, your life is still not, when you deny what you know to be God's calling and God's purpose in your life, it's just not going to go well.
Yeah.
No matter what it looks like, it's still not going well. But so even with a word from God, they still decided to go their own way. Both Rehoboam and Jeroboam had both fortified their cities to protect them, to fight to the end. In other words, if you look at it like that, I'm gonna fight to the end because I believe my side's right. I'm supposed to be the guy, not you. And so, I just have written up, it's probably more about the spiritual side of things. It's these guys, I mean, there is God involved. I mean, it's not totally two guys who have rejected God and said, we're not going to listen to God. It's just that they're letting themselves get in the way. And these are things that you read in some of these commentaries, and it's kind of like, what must these guys have thought, or what would motivate you to do that or to think that way? It would be kind of like if you said something from the pulpit and I was like, man, I don't get that, or I would be looking at that like, well, I wonder if he was thinking this, or I wonder if he had an experience that made him feel that way that I don't get, or and I think with some of these biblical characters, that's the way it is. What must they have been thinking? And so there was this almost list of things that says, if I go to the temple, I'll have to defer to Rehoboam. So in other words, what Jeroboam may have thought. I'll have to stand while he sits, because only the kings of the house of David are permitted to sit in the temple. When the people see this, they will know I'm not as high as he is. They will leave me and follow him. They will declare me a rebel. They will kill me if I break the law by sitting. I mean, this is, things that sound crazy to us. Well, do I sit or do I stand? I think, again, when a president takes instructions, like when you meet the leader of China, there's certain things probably maybe they don't shake hands, or they don't. One of the famous things was, I saw it just the other day, was when Obama was president and he met whoever was the leader of China at that time. But anyway, when he met him, he bowed down in front of him, because that's kind of what the China Well, people just took off on that. He's bowing down to the.
Yeah.
And then they showed a picture of President Trump, and he was shaking hands. Well, I mean, whether you're a fan, I don't care if you're a fan of either one of those guys. Those are things that are just as ridiculous as this is. Well, did he sit? Did he stand? Oh, he didn't. He didn't stand up when he was supposed to stand up. He doesn't have any respect, and again, it's been this way for the whole time, clear back thousands of years ago. But the court will condemn me to death. I can't refuse to go to the temple when everyone else goes. The only way I can maintain the kingdom is to keep people from going to the temple. The king would read from Deuteronomy, and what about if both of us read? I mean, there's all these things that go through. Well, if I go there, what if this happens, and what if that happens, and people won't respect me, and people won't honor me, and if I might look weak if I don't. So it's kind of like, well, I don't know whether I should go to this meeting or not, because it might do more harm to me, not being considerate of what's best for the people, but what does it look like for me? How are things going to go for me? He's going to be, if we read from the book of Deuteronomy, which they were supposed to do when they had these meetings, it would be like, I don't know, reading the opening statement for the opening of Congress or whatever, but they would have this where they would read from the book of Deuteronomy. Well, if he reads first, he's going to seem like he's the more, I mean, it was all about prestige, about looking kingly, in other words, not crying, and, I got to look like I'm strong here. So we probably ought to wrap it up there. We're about at our time limits here. We don't want to keep people too long. So.
All right. Well, this is the Grace Point Daily Podcast, verse by verse edition with Rick Maynard. If you really, really want to see him live, not just live on a screen, you can come to the local church that is Grace Point Assembly of God Church tonight at 6:30 p.m. Rick's going to be teaching as well.
Yes.
A couple more weeks and we're going to get back into Sunday school and all that good stuff. But thanks for listening for verse by verse each and every episode, each and every week. Like, share, subscribe to the Grace Point Daily Podcast. We're going to start pumping out some other episodes besides just the verse by verse. But you guys are awesome. We'll talk to you next time.